Today we're going to talk about a child abduction case and a serial killer, and what they have in common might surprise you. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. On December 4th, 1972, 7-year-old Stephen Stayner was walking home from school. That is, until a grown man stopped him and asked if his mother would like to donate to the church. Stephen said, "Yeah, I think she would." That's when Kenneth Parnell asked Stephen if he wanted a ride home. Stephen said yes because he figured his mom would like to donate to the church. In a later interview, Stephen would say, "They passed the road that I lived on, and they said that we'll just call your parents to see if you can stay the night." Of course, this made Stephen uncomfortable because he didn't know these people, but the two men that were in the car with him did say that they would call his mother when they arrived there. But Stephen wouldn't realize until it was too late what the intentions of this abductor were. Hours later, Stephen would be in a remote cabin in the woods, hours away from home. And back home, his family began desperately to search for the missing Stephen. And pretty much immediately, Kenneth would begin to manipulate the 7-year-old child. This man basically said, we got possession of you through the court, and you're now legally my child. Your parents didn't want you because they couldn't afford you. And Stephen was also now supposed to call Kenneth Dad. And then suddenly, Stephen was also given a new name. His new name was Dennis. In an interview, Stephen would go on to say that, "At the beginning, he sort of brainwashed me to believe that my parents didn't want me. So after a while, I was happy, but no one could ever imagine how long this would go on for." Unfortunately, for the next 7 years, Stephen would live as Dennis and call Kenneth his father. Although Stephen had to call Kenneth Dad, Kenneth was no father to Stephen. In fact, he physically and sexually abused him daily for those 7 years. Stephen would continue to live as Dennis, and Dennis would actually be enrolled in public schools. And one of these public schools was actually about 5 hours from his home. But Kenneth always managed to keep a low profile. He really didn't draw any attention to the family, even though neighbors would say that he was pretty weird. He would work a bunch of menial jobs. He didn't really keep a job for too long, but really it just kept him under the radar. Everybody just thought, oh, that's Kenneth and his son Dennis. Nothing seemed too out of place. And sometimes Kenneth would actually have to work away from the home, which meant that Dennis or Stephen could actually escape if he wanted to. But by this time, Stephen really didn't know where to go. He didn't have any place to escape to. He was told his parents didn't want him. He didn't know anybody. So where was he going to go? This was the only home that he had for the last 7 years. And this case is particularly strange because Stephen actually had a lot of freedom. Although Kenneth kind of bordered on being very controlling, he also really gave Stephen a lot of freedom to do whatever he wanted. He even gave Stephen a dog, which obviously people thought was a really genuine gesture. And somehow Kenneth allowed Stephen to live without boundaries. He was allowed to go where he wanted and do what he wanted. And Kenneth apparently was never worried that he was going to tell somebody. He really did have total control over this child. And during this time, Stephen's family back home is trying to keep his face in the newspapers and in the media. They knew their son was out there and they wanted desperately to bring him home. They never gave up hope that he was alive, even though all of these years had passed. Unfortunately, Stephen would become too old for Kenneth, and Kenneth would hatch a sick plan. He needed another son. Kenneth would start by asking his babysitter and girlfriend to abduct a child for him. Barbara Mathias was a single mother and the girlfriend to Kenneth. She also babysat Stephen quite often. Barbara would actually meet Kenneth about 9 months after Stephen had been abducted, but she insisted that she never knew that Stephen wasn't Kenneth's son. Apparently, the couple dated for 9 months, and then Barbara would move in with Kenneth and his son, Dennis. She apparently had a son named Lloyd who was 12 years old at the time, and Stephen and Lloyd became like brothers. They would play together, they'd hang out together, and Barbara became Stephen's quote-unquote mother for about 2 years. But Barbara wasn't a good mother. In fact, she actually raped Stephen on many occasions. And at that time, he was only an 11-year-old boy. Stephen would actually allege that at the age of 9, Barbara and Kenneth would force Stephen to have sex with the two of them on 9 separate occasions. But when Barbara failed to abduct a child, Kenneth then turned to Stephen, who was only 14. But Stephen kept hatching plans to purposely fail on abducting a child. He never wanted another child to go through what he had been going through all of these years. But Kenneth would unfortunately succeed in abducting a 5-year-old boy. In February of 1980, Kenneth would abduct Timothy White, who was 5. Kenneth would bring the 5-year-old boy home and present him to Stephen as his brother. And Stephen was in pure horror over the thought of what Timothy was now going to have to live through. So on the evening of March 1st, 1980, Stephen gathered Timothy, and while Kenneth was at work, began to walk and hitchhike 50 miles to a police station in Timothy's hometown. And when he arrived at this police station, he was obviously needed to write down his statement, and one of the lines he wrote was, "I know my first name is Stephen." So after all of these years and all of the brainwashing, he at least knew that his first name was Stephen. And to everyone's disbelief, Stephen Stayner was alive and his family was overwhelmed. They couldn't believe it. Even though they held on hope for all of these years, they were still shocked that their son was coming home. And he was a hero. He had rescued a 5-year-old boy from going through everything that he had to go through. But unfortunately, the story wouldn't have a happy ending. Obviously, when Stephen is brought home, there's just so much chaos surrounding this case. People are flabbergasted and shocked because often abduction cases don't end this way, especially after 7 years. There was tons of media and it was very sensational, and it was just a crazy, crazy time for the family who wanted to connect with their son who had been missing for 7 years. Stephen would actually deny any sexual abuse by Kenneth, but unfortunately, police found pictures of the abuse. Stephen would say that he basically denied it because he didn't want to talk about it. It was very hard for him to talk about this abuse. And because the trial was so public, Stephen really got so much abuse at school. People would ridicule him and call him gay and call him names, and they just made fun of him for abuse that happened to him. And I'm getting so worked up about that because I'm just flabbergasted that anybody would have the audacity to make fun of somebody that was abused so severely for 7 years. I mean, just to ridicule someone like that is absolutely heartbreaking. And because of all of this attention and this media attention and it being so public, Stephen pretty much went off the rails for a few years. He was drinking, and it was just really overall very hard for him to cope. He really was having a hard time in all areas of his life. And really, he was raised by a kidnapper who let him drink and smoke and do whatever he wanted at any time. So going back to his home, where his family had rules and structure, was really hard for him. So obviously a healthy and normal home life really put him at odds with his parents. He was not used to it. And sadly, Stephen would publicly question if life would have been better off if he never came back home. And really, he didn't get much counseling, apparently at the request of his father, which I feel is really strange. Kenneth Parnell was actually found guilty in 2 separate trials for kidnapping. And this will blow your mind because it blew my mind. He received 7 years in prison for kidnapping 2 children, one of which he held prisoner for 7 years. This was just absolutely unbelievable. And that was the maximum allowed under California law at the time. What's even more mind-blowing, that after 5 years in prison, he was released on good behavior. Kenneth would eventually die of natural causes in January of 2008 while serving 25 years to life in prison for trying to buy a 4-year-old boy. I'm sure he actually caused much more damage to other children during this time, but I haven't read otherwise. I'm just so flabbergasted that this man abducted 2 little boys, one of which he held captive and abused for 7 years, and only got a 7-year sentence. It's just disgusting. I actually want to go back to Barbara for a minute. Barbara actually met Stephen's real parents. And no, I'm not kidding. She literally met Stephen's real parents. And apparently Barbara and Stephen's mom had a pleasant meeting. Apparently Stephen's mom said, "It's been hell for the last 7 years." And Barbara would reply, "I know, that's why I wanted to come. I know how I would have felt if it was my kid." She would also go on to say that, "I thought that because I babysat for him, you would want to know he was a good boy all that time. He was always a nice boy and he called me mother like my own kids did. I don't care how late I get to sleep tonight, I'll be in heaven." She also went on to say that she couldn't believe it. She didn't think Dennis was a kidnapped or abducted child. But her own son, Lloyd, was being abused by Kenneth. And I have no doubt that Barbara actually knew this, as she was abusing Stephen. She was raping an 11-year-old child, and I am so thoroughly disgusted by this woman. Apparently, Barbara's son Lloyd was eventually killed by his stepfather, and obviously, because of all the attention following Stephen, this child, this young boy, was just totally forgotten, and he was also abused by Kenneth. So not much is known about Barbara right now. Apparently at the time that Stephen had been brought home, she was 44 years old, but after that, I don't think anybody seems to know what happened to her. And I'm sure that's for a reason. She knows what she did, She knows that she would be implicated eventually in this, and she just fled. Eventually, Stephen would meet his wife, Jody, and they would settle down and have 2 children together. At the time, Stephen was only 20 years old. His wife, Jody, would recall that he was just a really good family man. He was a good dad. He was just a naturally good person, and she really loved him. She said that it also just all came natural to him. And then in 1980, a movie was actually coming out about Stephen's life. The movie was called I Know My First Name Is Stephen, and it would air in 2 parts. It was also nominated for 4 Emmy Awards. It was a big movie. It was a big premiere. Unfortunately, the night before the Emmy Awards, Stephen was riding his motorcycle home when he was fatally struck by a car and would later die. He was only 24 years old. We also have to look at Timothy in this case because he was an abducted child. Obviously, his arrival back home went quite a bit smoother because he was only 5. He hadn't been abducted for as long as Stephen, and things pretty much went back to normal for the little boy. But he did remain close to Stephen, and he was even a pallbearer at his funeral. And because of the horrific thing that happened to Timothy, he actually became a sheriff. He spoke out against child sexual abuse. He had 2 kids of his own. He was married. He was just living a really good life. But unfortunately, at the age of 35, a pulmonary embolism would take his life. And of course, this case is far from over. This wasn't the only tragedy that was going to affect Stephen's family. Unfortunately, Stephen was abducted and spent 7 years away from his family, and then just when they got him back, he died at the age of 24 in a motorcycle accident. He was hit by a car. They also didn't realize that they would be losing another son. Kerry was Stephen's brother, and he was only 11 when Stephen went missing. Kerry would explain that after Stephen was abducted, he had a lot of stress and pressure. He said that he felt neglected by his parents, who were obviously grieving their son. And then after the abduction of his brother, eventually Kerry would actually go stay with his uncle Jesse for some time. But strangely, a year later, Jesse was actually murdered in his own home. He was shot and killed, and the murderer was never found. And Kerry would later claim that Jesse had been molesting him shortly after his brother had been abducted. And many people believe that Kerry had actually murdered his uncle. In 1997, Kerry was actually hired as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel in California. This was just outside the highway entrance to Yosemite Park. But for 6 months in 1999, women were being murdered at this park. 2 teens and 2 adults had been found in the vicinity of the park. 2 of these people had actually been stuffed in their rental car and had their bodies burnt very badly. One of these people was even decapitated, and all of them were killed at close range, whether they were strangled or had their throats cut. It was very personal. The FBI would actually hone in on Kerry as a suspect. He was a handyman working at the motel where 3 of the 4 victims had also been staying. And one report actually claims that they saw Kerry and his car at one of the victims' homes on the day of her killing. Apparently, after Kerry was detained for questioning, Kerry would tell police officers that he would confess to the crimes if they got him pizza and a collection of child pornography. Although they clearly would not do that, Kerry did confess to the crimes. In 2002, he was sentenced to death row and is apparently still on death row for his crimes. So at the time of Kerry's trial, a psychiatrist actually claimed that Stephen's kidnapping didn't actually lead to Kerry's crimes. It didn't urge him to murder. It wasn't because he was neglected or anything like that after his brother was abducted. He would go on to say that there's no doubt Kerry had a troubled childhood, but it wasn't just the thing about his brother. He went on to say that it was most likely the sexual abuse that spurred this on. He said, many children who are sexually abused are damaged in their sexual development. He would also note that Kerry, quote, took pleasure from non-consenting sexual acts, attempting to rape one of the victims. He wasn't a sadist in traditional sense. Kerry's paraphilia wasn't rooted in the enjoyment of his victim's anguish so much as it was the enjoyment of successfully controlling his victims by force. So this case, from beginning to end, is just unbelievable because not only was Stephen abducted and held captive for 7 years by this deranged man, his brother would go on to be a serial killer. Kerry himself would say that he didn't believe his brother's abduction played into it. In fact, at the age of 7, he had thought about murdering people. Of course, this is an argument that one can say, you know, was it nature? Was it nurture? Was it his environment? Was he born this way? We don't know, but one may assume that Kerry has an idea about this. So this family dealt with so much in such a short time. Their son was abducted, he was missing for 7 years, and when he was brought back, it wasn't the child they obviously knew. They had a really hard time connecting with him. Things were kind of out of control. Obviously, when they just got him back and he was a dad now and things were going well, he died. He was hit by a car and he died. And then their other son becomes a serial killer and kills 4 women. I mean, these people could not catch a break. I would love to know your thoughts on this case, so pop in the comments below. This case was suggested by one of our viewers, so I thank you for that. It was a great case to cover. But that's it for today. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Of course, if you have a suggestion for a case you'd like me to cover, pop in the comments, and I promise I will do my best to get to every single one that I can. While you wait for another upload, check out some other videos on the channel, and of course, your guys' support means the world to me, and I thank you so much. See you next time.